For 34 years, I thought I had the perfect marriage and the perfect best friend. I was wrong about both. What I discovered 6 months after my husband's funeral didn't just break my heart. It revealed a betrayal so deep, so calculated, that it changed everything I thought I knew about the people I loved most. This is the story of how my best friend's greed and lies cost her everything she thought she'd stolen from me. My name is Diane Matthews, and until last year, I thought I was living a blessed life. My husband Bob and I met in college. He was studying business. I was getting my teaching degree. We married young, built a life together, and raised 2 wonderful children. Carol Henderson became my best friend when we were both young mothers in the same neighborhood. Our kids played together. We carpooled to soccer practice, shared recipes, and supported each other through everything: job changes, teenage drama, aging parents. When Bob was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 2 years ago, Carol was my rock. She drove me to appointments when I was too emotional to drive myself. She organized meal trains, helped with insurance paperwork, even stayed overnight at the hospital when Bob was having his worst days. Bob fought for 18 months. 18 months of hope and fear and treatments that left him weak, but never broke his spirit. Carol was there for all of it. I used to tell people I couldn't have survived without her. I had no idea she was planning to survive without me. Bob passed away on a Thursday morning in October. Peaceful, holding my hand, just like he'd always said he wanted. Carl was one of the first people I called. She came over immediately, helped me make arrangements, held me while I cried. The funeral was beautiful. Bob would have loved it, full of laughter and stories about his terrible golf game and his legendary barbecue sauce. Carol gave a eulogy about what a wonderful friend Bob had been to her family. She talked about his kindness, his generosity, how he helped her husband's construction business get started. What she didn't mention was that 3 weeks before Bob died, while he was barely conscious from pain medication, she convinced him to co-sign a loan for her husband's business expansion, $50,000 from her home equity line. I found the paperwork a month after the funeral, buried in a stack of medical bills. Bob's signature was shaky, barely legible. The date was from a day when he'd been so medicated he couldn't remember our children's names. When I called Carol to ask about it, she said, "Oh, honey, Bob insisted on helping us. You know how generous he was." But here's what she didn't know: Bob and I talked about that loan. He told me he was uncomfortable with it, that we needed to keep our finances secure for my future. That loan was just the beginning. Once I started really looking at our finances, I found things that made my blood run cold. Credit card charges I didn't recognize. Checks written to Carol's real estate company for consulting fees that I'd never heard about. Over the course of Bob's illness, Carol had systematically convinced my dying husband to invest in her various business ventures, a total of nearly $90,000. Money that was supposed to be my security, my future. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was the realization that while I was focused on caring for my husband, my best friend was manipulating him, taking advantage of his medication-clouded judgment and his generous heart. I confronted Carol on a Tuesday afternoon in her perfect kitchen. I laid out all the documents, all the evidence. And you know what she said? She told me, "Diane, you're grieving. You're not thinking clearly. Bob wanted to help us. He believed in our dreams." Then she said something I'll never forget. "Besides, it's not like you need the money. You have his life insurance, his pension. Some of us have to work for our security." As if stealing from a dying man was just good business sense. That night, I sat in the house Bob and I had shared for 28 years, surrounded by his things, his books, his coffee mug still in the sink because I couldn't bear to wash it. And I realized that Carol hadn't just stolen our money, she'd stolen my ability to trust my own memories of Bob's final months. But somewhere between the tears and the rage, I remembered something Bob used to say: "Diane, you're the smartest person I know. You just don't always know it yet." And I realized that Carol had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated the widow of a man who'd spent 30 years in the insurance business. Bob had taught me to read contracts, to understand legal documents, to always keep detailed records. And I had records of everything. I hired Jessica Chun, an estate planning attorney who specialized in elder financial abuse. Yes, that's what it's called when someone takes advantage of a person's diminished capacity to manipulate them financially. Jessica told me that what I'd shown her was a textbook case of financial exploitation. The timing of these transactions, the amounts, the fact that they occurred when Bob was heavily medicated, it all painted a very clear picture. Jessica explained that we had several options. We could pursue criminal charges for elder abuse. We could file a civil lawsuit for the return of the money plus damages. Or we could try to handle it privately first. I chose option 4. I decided to give Carol exactly what she'd given me, a betrayal she'd never see coming. You see, Carol had built her entire life on image. Perfect house, perfect marriage, perfect reputation in our community. She was the president of the Country Club Women's Auxiliary, ran the annual charity auction, had her photo in the local paper at least once a month. What Carol didn't know was that her reputation was built on a foundation of lies. And I was about to expose every single one of them. My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been watching Carol Henderson for years. She'd always thought there was something off about that woman. Too perfect, you know? When I asked her what she'd seen during Bob's illness, she told me everything. Mrs. Rodriguez had witnessed Carol coming to our house multiple times when I was at work, staying for hours with Bob when he was barely coherent. She'd seen Carol leaving with boxes of Bob's things Carol claimed Bob had given to her family. But I had something even better than witness testimony. I had Carol's own words. You see, Bob had been keeping a journal during his illness, something his therapist had suggested to help him process his feelings. And in that journal, he'd written about feeling pressured by Carol, about being confused by financial documents she'd brought him to sign. Bob wrote, Carol keeps saying Diane doesn't need to know about these investments, that it would just worry her. But something feels wrong. I can't think clearly anymore, and I'm scared I'm making mistakes that will hurt Diane later. As I dug deeper into Carol's activities during Bob's illness, I discovered a pattern of manipulation that went far beyond just the money. She had systematically isolated Bob from me during his most vulnerable moments. I found out that Carol had been scheduling her visits to our house specifically when I was at work or running errands. She'd call me and suggest I take a break, go grocery shopping, get some fresh air all while she stayed behind with Bob. I discovered text messages between Carol and her husband discussing their financial problems, messages that dated back to before Bob's diagnosis. They'd been planning to ask us for money long before Bob got sick. His illness just gave them the perfect opportunity. But what really opened my eyes was a conversation I remembered from months earlier. Carol had asked me detailed questions about our finances, our savings, our investments, even our life insurance policies. At the time, I thought she was just being a concerned friend. Now I realized she was conducting reconnaissance. I also discovered that Carol had convinced Bob to make her the beneficiary on one of his smaller investment accounts, $15,000 that was supposed to go to our grandchildren's college fund. She told him it was temporary, just until her husband's business got back on its feet. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that Carol hadn't just taken advantage of Bob's illness. She'd orchestrated a systematic campaign to extract as much money as possible from our family during our most vulnerable time. I decided to quietly reach out to other people in our community who had dealt with Carol professionally. What I discovered was that her pattern of manipulation extended far beyond our family. I spoke with several of Carol's former real estate clients who had complaints about her business practices, overcharging for services, pressuring elderly clients to sell their homes quickly, even taking kickbacks from contractors without disclosing them to her clients. I also investigated her role in the various charity organizations she was involved with. What I found was shocking. Carol had been skimming money from fundraising events for years. Small amounts that wouldn't be noticed individually, but that added up to thousands of dollars over time. At the country club, I discovered that Carol had been using her position as president of the Women's Auxiliary to award catering contracts to her husband's company. I inflated prices that benefited them personally while overcharging the club. Picture that emerged was of a woman who had built her entire lifestyle on a foundation of small frauds and manipulations. She wasn't just a grieving friend who had made a mistake, she was a predator who targeted vulnerable people. I compiled all of this information into a comprehensive dossier. Not just the evidence of what she'd done to Bob and me, but a complete picture of her pattern of behavior over many years. I walked into Carol's office on a busy Friday afternoon. When I knew she'd have clients and colleagues around, I brought Jessica with me, along with a folder containing copies of every document, every bank statement, every page of Bob's journal. I told Carol she had two choices. She could quietly return every penny she'd taken from Bob, plus interest, and we'd handle this privately. Or I could file criminal charges for elder financial abuse, and make sure everyone in town knew exactly what kind of person she really was. Carol tried to bluff at first. She said, "You can't prove anything. Bob was competent when he made those decisions." But when Jessica laid out the legal definition of diminished capacity and explained how Bob's medical records would support our case, Carol's perfect composure finally cracked. Then Carol said something that revealed who she'd always been. "Fine, but you'll never get your precious reputation back, Diane. Everyone will know that your perfect husband was giving money to other women behind your back." She actually thought she could shame me into backing down, I told her. "Carol, the difference between you and me is that I'm not ashamed of the truth. Bob was a good man who was manipulated by someone he trusted. You're a woman who stole from a dying friend. Let's see which story the community finds more compelling." Then I showed Carol the rest of my evidence. The complaints from her real estate clients, the missing charity funds, the inflated contracts at the country club. I told her that if she wanted to make this public, I was ready to expose everything. Carol returned $87,000 within 2 weeks, not because she suddenly grew a conscience, but because Jessica had made it clear that the alternative was criminal prosecution and public humiliation. But the money was just the beginning. Word travels fast in a small community, especially when it involves someone as prominent as Carol Henderson. Within a month, she'd resigned from the country club board, stuck down from the charity auction committee, and her real estate business had lost several major clients. Her husband's construction company folded 6 months. Later turns out those investments Bob had made were the only thing keeping them afloat. They had to sell their McMansion and move to a smaller house across town. Carol and I haven't spoken since that day in her office. I heard through Mrs. Rodriguez that Carol tells people I made the whole thing up, that I was a bitter widow looking for someone to blame, that I was jealous of her success, her marriage, her perfect life. But the funny thing about the truth is, it doesn't care how you dress it up. You can twist it, bury it, spin it into whatever version you need to sleep at night, but the truth has a way of standing still. It doesn't rush. It just waits. And when it finally arrives, there's nowhere to hide. I still have days when I miss Bob so deeply it takes the wind out of me. Grief is strange that way. It doesn't follow a schedule. It sneaks in through familiar songs, old recipes, or the way sunlight hits a particular chair in the living room. But what I don't miss is the lie I was living at the end. The lie that everything around me was safe, whole, untouchable after everything that happened. I kept thinking, how did I not see it? How did I let someone like Carol so deep into my life? But over time, I stopped blaming myself because trust isn't a weakness. It's a strength, one that can only be exploited by people who have none of their own. I didn't just survive what Carol did. I learned from it. I learned that strength doesn't always look like yelling or slamming doors. Sometimes it looks like restraint, like gathering the facts, building your case, speaking only when it counts, and letting the silence speak louder than revenge ever could. And here's something else I learned. Justice doesn't always come from the courtroom. Sometimes it comes from the quiet knowledge that you stood your ground when it mattered, that you chose dignity over drama, truth over reputation, and healing over hate. My life looks different now. Quieter, slower, but it's honest. Every corner of my home holds a story I'm no longer afraid to tell. Every photo, every book, every cup of coffee I sip alone reminds me that I rebuilt something from the ashes. Not just my finances or my reputation, but my sense of self. And if you're listening to this, if you've ever felt blindsided by someone you trusted, let me say this. What happened to you is not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of theirs. You are not broken. You are not foolish. You are not weak for loving deeply. You are powerful because you survived it. And because now, I've started going through Bob's things, not with the desperate clinging I had before, but with gratitude. Each item tells a story of a life well lived, a marriage that was real despite how it ended. Carol couldn't steal that from me, no matter how hard she tried. I've become something of an advocate in our community now. Other widows come to me when they suspect someone is taking advantage of them. I help them document things, connect them with attorneys, remind them that they don't have to suffer in silence. Just last month, I helped Mrs. Patterson expose her nephew who was stealing from her checking account. The week before that, I assisted Mr. Chan in getting his money back from a contractor who was overcharging him for unnecessary repairs. We've started a support group, Wise Women Warriors we call ourselves. We meet every Tuesday at the library. We share our stories, our strategies, our strength. We remind each other that age doesn't make us vulnerable, silence does, and maybe, just maybe, one day Carol will realize what she truly lost. Not the money, not the reputation, but the friendship of a woman who would have stood by her for life if only she deserved it. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you loved? Someone who wore the mask of loyalty only to use your pain for their gain? I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments because sometimes healing starts when we realize we're not alone. And if this story spoke to something inside you, if it reminded you that healing is possible, then stay a while. We tell stories here for women who've lost everything and still found their power. The next one starts right here.